Paranormal Dimensions is a regular feature on Mondays on the Paranormal UK radio network.
Hello, this is Michael Feely, and you're listening to the Paranormal UK radio network, the UK's biggest paranormal network, and this is Paranormal Dimensions with David Young.
Hello and welcome to the show. Thank you for that intro, Michael. That was very nice of you to do that. Right, now I've got a few call-outs for people. These are all going to be UK-based today. Call-outs for Steve Coop, Manchester, UK, Isaac Coy, London, UK, and Colin McFadden of Santry, Cambridge, UK. I think it's McFadden. I think I pronounced that right. But if anyone would like a call-out on the show, just drop me a line and I'll see what I can do to sort of pick you out of the hat. Right. Now I've got another wonderful guest for you today, Mr. Andrew Johnson. He's got his, let's say he's got his fingers in many pies to do with all sorts of different subjects. But today I want to try and concentrate on one of his specialities. There's only one of the secret space program. This is only one of his specialities. I mean, the man's quite a genius in my eyes. But anyway, I'd like to say hello to Andrew Johnson. Hello, Andrew. Welcome to the show.
Hello, David. Thanks for inviting me and for that kind introduction.
No, that's all right. I mean, you blow my mind whenever I hear you speaking, and I've met you a few times, and I think, how does he hold all that knowledge in his head? He doesn't seem to have many notes and things around him.
Yeah, well, again, it's partly to do with backgrounds. I think, most people that are able to do that have some kind of experience that helps them, with that process, really. And some people, it's a natural talent, isn't it? But,
yeah.
I think sometimes you sort of have to develop it out of necessity. And in my case, it's, I did a lot of software development work, and that involves you needing to hold quite a lot of information and juggle it, mentally, so that you can sort of, you can build up a system and understand how it works and debug it, basically. And I think a lot of it comes from that, so yeah.
Do you think you might have a photographic memory for a lot of the stuff? Because I don't know how you seem to, because I mean, I read stuff and I can sort of hold it for about an hour, and it seems to be, what was I reading?
I wouldn't say I've got a photographic memory, really. I know some people that have, but I've got a fairly good memory. But it's certainly not perfect, and I'll forget very basic things sometimes, and you have these sort of senior moments, and I get those as well, where you see somebody, hear somebody on the radio, and you think, I know who that is, and I can't remember who it is. And I get that just like everybody else, and I know that some people don't have that, that they're able to go bang and they're straight there, and so yeah, I definitely haven't got a photographic memory.
But you do a lot of tutoring, don't you?
Right, yes, that's what I do I work for the Open University part-time, and it's all distance learning. And yeah, I do tutoring, so that involves holding a bit of information in your head. But with it being distance learning, it's pretty much done by email. So you could just go and look stuff up, and if you respond the next day or something, it's not a problem. So it's good that way. If you haven't got a perfect memory, you can go and check things out, look things up, and then get back to the students. So it works out quite well.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, really, I know, like I said, you're into quite a few different things, like 9/11 and all sorts of stuff. But I think I'd like to concentrate on the secret space program, if you wouldn't mind today. I know you're very knowledgeable about it, and I've got quite a few kind of questions that I've always thought there is something going on, because of all these, they seem to lose billions of dollars every year from the Pentagon, and I wonder if a lot of this money does actually go into the space programs, or the secret space program.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the same question that other people ask, and I can't prove, where the money comes from, and I haven't particularly looked at the money side in any great depth. But my background again is in sort of technology, and I suppose that's given me more of a sort of tendency to focus on those sort of areas of technology. And as I think we may have discussed before, and I put it in my presentations. I know you've been to at least a couple of them.
Oh yeah.
And
I'll catch more if I could.
Yeah, right, of course. And I've a background in physics, you see, so I tend to look at those aspects, and particularly what intrigued me getting into the looking at the potential secret space program was the anti-gravity technology, because you and I both have a very strong interest in the UFO stuff.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think when you start to get into that, and you start to think, and you start to accept that people are seeing these craft, and in many cases, maybe not all, but in many cases, they appear to be, physical, metallic, or material craft that, are landing and are propelled here by some method. And that, to me, is one of the starting points for looking at the idea of possibly this technology being put into a secret space program. In other words, we know that things are coming here. I accepted that long ago, and I suspect you do too.
Have you ever? Sorry to interrupt you. Have you ever seen a UFO, Andrew?
I've had 4 sightings in my life. None of them particularly spectacular. Mainly sort of at a distance, lights in the sky sort of thing. And I had one when I was about 10 years old, which was I call it an acrobatic star. Oh. It looked like a star, but it was kind of doing acrobatics around another star, and I knew it wasn't a comet or a meteorite or a plane or anything like that. And that was when I was 10 years old.
Yeah, that's very similar to the one I saw, because I was actually sitting on my steps. I've told this story quite a few times on here, right. But I was actually watching a star move and stop and move and stop. And this would have been in the late 50s. So, right. So what that was, I've always said, I don't know what the hell that was. But of course at the time I didn't realise it. I thought it was just a star moving and stopping. It's only later on when you realise, stars don't do that. So what was that?
That's right, yeah. Yeah, and I had one in 1990, around about then when I was stopping in Rugby, and I actually have got another book out which is free. All my books are free to download in PDF form, and I talk about the sightings in the Acknowledged book, which is the latest one I kind of put out there, I say free download. And so I mentioned a little bit more about those sightings, but I think the most interesting one that I had was in 2010 when I was in Pembrokeshire visiting a friend, and it was about sort of 10 o'clock at night, and I was sitting in his front room, and I had a sort of not a very good view out of the front window, but it was a good enough view to see this orange and white orb coming over the house, and I think we must have stuck their head out the door or something, because it was quite near the front door, and then it kind of went to behind the house, and this house was sort of at the bottom of quite a steep hill with trees, and so we quickly lost sight of these 2 orbs, but that was very, very clear and very unusual. They were flying in parallel, these 2 orbs. It clearly wasn't, a plane or a Chinese lantern or a balloon or anything like that.
Oh, indeed. And orange is a very common colour, isn't it? I mean, the one I saw in 67, I believe it was like a large oval object going across the sky. There was just one of them at the time. But that was orange, and it seemed to be different shades of orange. It wasn't, and it wasn't like a bright light. It was like an incandescent sort of light going across.
Oh. Yeah. Oh, wow.
That was about 67.
Yeah. So you must have had a few sightings then, have you? Or?
Well, that one when I was young was about 10. Was watching a moving star, and in that one in 67, what I would call that was my main one. Only lately, when I've been living in Suffolk, when I've gone down to Rendlesham Woods a few times, I've seen a similar thing about moving stars, stars moving and stopping. And a few of us saw it at the same time. Brenda Butler, with her and a few others at the time. Well, we saw this star moving and stopping. And then just after that, another one started moving and stopping, believe it or not. And this would have been about sort of like 2 o'clock in the morning. Yeah. So you've got a really nice dark night, so you can see the stars clearly. I think maybe if it would have been a bit lighter, you might not have seen them. I don't know if these UFOs and things have cloaking abilities and things.
I think some of them do. Yeah, I mean, there's a good film from British Columbia from 2003, and you can see this thing sort of materialise and then disappear. They do seem to just disappear like a puff of, or just shoot off, don't they? Yeah, some of them do. But I think that, you're looking at a whole range of technologies. And I mean, that's something I can mention actually as a potential example of that, on the secret space program stuff, which I'll probably sort of try and, build up to a little bit. Yeah, because
I took you off that, didn't I? I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. No, that's fine. I mean, we're just having a chat, aren't we? So, I'd rather sort of, just, do that, whatever takes our interest, rather than sort of try and stick to a talking points list. I think it's better to have a little bit of discussion when we feel like it. Yeah. So, yeah. But so going back to so when, in other words, we've both had sightings then, so you can just look at that and kind of just accept it at face value kind of thing, or you can, me being the curious person that I am, and a software engineering background, I've always been interested in how things work, why things work in a certain way, or quite often why they don't work, particularly when you're trying to fix something, obviously. And then half of an engineer's job is obviously fixing things, so you've got to work out why it doesn't work, which involves actually working out how it does work or how it should work. And that really was my motivation behind looking into, the UFO issue. And I think it was that, I started to re-get into this in 2003, with the Disclosure Project that I discovered then, which of course was in 2001. And that was the main event, I should say, Stephen Greer's event. And quite closely on the heels of that, I started to read about people like Nick Cook, and he was one of the key people in my, opening the door to the anti-gravity type of stuff, and that was one of the first areas I looked at through his book, The Hunt for Zero Point. And, he doesn't specifically talk about a secret space program, hardly at all, actually, but he is mainly looking at the issue of there being anti-gravity technology. And he made this documentary, which you can still find in various places online, called $1 Billion Secret, which was made in 1999. And I think I've got a link to that on my website, might be on the homepage somewhere. So you can, they keep taking it down, then somebody else re-uploads it. So
I'll put all those links on my Paranormal Dimensions page when this show goes out. So.
Yeah, it's checktheevidence.com for people that want to go and look. But yeah, great if you can put a link.
Yeah,
and that was a good starting point. As I say, Nick Cook's book now is getting on in years itself. I mean, he published it in year 2000. And that I think, when you start to read that, and it's very lucidly written, it's not a particularly technical book, because although Nick Cook is a defense journalist, he doesn't have a strong science background. I think he might have a little bit of science in his background, but he focuses more on uncovering, how he uncovered certain information. And, for example, he tried to organise a meeting with a chap called George Trimble, I think was his name, George S. Trimble. And he, I think, worked for Lockheed at one time. And he'd agreed to talk to Nick Cook because he'd apparently worked on a classified, program in the 50s or something, and it appeared that it might have something to do with an anti-gravity technology of some kind. So Nick Cook had somehow got in touch with this chap, and they'd set up an interview, and I think he was either going to phone him, or he might have even been going to see him in the States somewhere. And then he contacted him at the agreed time and got a different voice sort of thing from the one he was expecting. And he said, I don't know what he said to this guy, but he's run away. He doesn't want to speak to you, And so Nick Cook was, then became rather intrigued as to why this guy suddenly declined, and then he started to explore, some of the Black World programs. For example, I think he started looking at the early days of the U-2 spy plane, and he was able to get in touch with one guy who had actually, I think, if I get the details right, he'd worked on another design which didn't become the U-2, but it was a competing design, and it was I think it was called Kingfish, this project. And this guy was even he was, I think it was Bob Widmer was his name. I think even he was very reluctant to speak to Nick Cook, even though this program was like, I don't know, 45 or 50 years old by the time Nick Cook wanted to speak to this guy. But he did, he managed to get to speak to him, and he's in the documentary, I think, in the 1999 documentary. And so Nick Cook also, for example, investigated some of the stories that have come out about, the Nazi technology, and there's all these stories about, the Thule Society and the Vril Society. There's all these stories of the Vril Society having a moon landing in 1920 and a Mars landing in 1962, and I don't know what to make of those stories, frankly.
I was just going to ask you that. Do you believe they could have happened, or?
Well, I'm not sure. I believe that there might be something like that could have happened, but I haven't really seen the evidence to allow me to go much further than just keeping the possibility open. But I think what is more concrete is if you look at some of the stuff in Nick Cook's Hunt for Zero Point, and he looks at the work of Viktor Schauberger, and he developed this repulsine craft. And I write about this in the Finding the Secret Space Program book, which, as I say, is a free PDF download, or you can get a paperback.
You get a hardback, hard copy.
Softback, hard copy, yeah. And so, for example, the Viktor Schauberger, which was like, if you look at this device, and you can look this up online as well, you don't have to look in my book, and it is like a saucer-shaped device, and it actually reminds me more of I think the device he built wasn't enormous. It was like a giant spinning top, and it looks like one of these. I don't know if when you were young, or you've had young children, where you got one of these spinning tops that you have a metal rod and you push it down and it spins up, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, the Schauberger repulsine, or one of them, it kind of looks a little bit like that, except without the handle thing at the top, or the bar or spindle, or whatever you want to call it. And Schauberger apparently, he would somehow have this mechanism whereby water would be injected into this device at high pressure, and then it would get spun into a vortex. And at some point, when this water is in this vortex and spinning at high speed, this is when you get these unusual effects, and the thing would actually levitate and take off, according to Schauberger. And unfortunately, we don't have a working device. We don't have any video. We have some still photographs, but there appears to be a trail of evidence leading to the USA, and I write about this in my book and Nick Cook's in his book, and there is some paper trail that you can follow, and there are some records in Viktor Schauberger's archives, and it is known, for example, at the end of the Second World War, Schauberger did go to the US. They promised him the Earth to work on their programs, and then they stole that technology off him, and there's some evidence that they did build a device which flew. So, that's a bit more concrete than some of the other stuff. Again, doesn't prove that there was a secret space program, but I think there is sufficient evidence to say that they were working on a device or a unit which was unconventional. It wasn't using chemical rockets. And that is, in the white world, we are told the only way to propel a craft is essentially using chemical rockets, or possibly an ion drive, which is really not that much different from a chemical rocket. It works by the principle of mass displacement, as you would call it, where a fuel is burned or pressurized or whatever, or charged up, and then that fuel is ejected out of the back of the the craft, and that generates the propulsion, that generates the thrust. So the sorts of technology which Schauberger was beginning, I think, to exploit, and there are other examples we can mention in the next few minutes, is some type of method for exploiting what might be called the 0-point field, or vacuum energy, or the quantum realm. If there's various names for it. The ether is another name for it. So this idea that there is an underlying ether or something, some people might call it the 0-point field or quantum foam, but there is a way of actually extracting energy from that domain and then putting it to work, either to produce free energy, in a form of electricity of some kind, or as a form of propulsion. And this was something that interested me again about Nick Cook, because he basically, I think, made this point very clearly, in maybe not in his book, but I think that when he was doing talks after he'd written his book, he started to get involved in the hunt for free energy devices, and I think he realized quite rightly that the two things are connected. And even, again, for my own interest in this, when I found the Disclosure Project with Stephen Greer, he was the one that made the connection for me between the UFO issue and the energy issue, because of the propulsion, in that when you start looking into anti-gravity and stuff, you start to find free energy effects and vice versa. And so it was this which I thought, there's got to be a connection. And that, I think, is why a big part of the UFO cover-up is to do with, if you start to know a lot about UFOs, you start to know about free energy. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that's a big thing, that they don't really want people to think about those things very much. And even Stephen Greer himself, as to some extent, he's kind of backed away from that. And I've written quite a lot about that separately, and I won't go into that now. But that for me is still very, very much a key issue, and the one which you mentioned. I'd looked at various different topics, and that's true. And I think it's that which cross connects with almost all of them. The energy, the exploitation, and the manipulation of energy, in a completely different way to what we have in our current everyday world, with burning fuels and even solar panels and stuff are fairly sort of basic stuff, they're compared to what this type of UFO technology can do,
So, as far as Stephen Greer is concerned, because some people do actually say that he's a fraud and everything. I'm kind of on the fence with it. You seem to be quite convinced that he's what he says he is.
Well, not really. It's a complicated picture with Greer, and I've written a whole chapter about Greer in this Acknowledged book, not the Secret Space Program one, but the Acknowledged book, as I've called it. And that title of that book is based on a title of one of his books, which is called Unacknowledged, and I deliberately chose that title. And the thing with Greer is that he's brought out a lot of good information, and a lot of it I've found is valid and legitimate, but unfortunately he seems to have this enormous ego, and he seems to be into asking for a lot of money to make film, like free energy projects, and that's my biggest problem with Greer. Is, for example, he started a free energy initiative in 2001. That was then replaced in 2007. I've written all this up. That 2007 one was then replaced in 2010. That was then replaced in 2013. And I think there's been another one since. So it looks like he's taken in probably something like, it must be getting close to $1 million in probably since 2001, so about 18 years. I think if somebody went and looked at all the accounts, if they could get them for all those things that Greer has done, they would be getting towards the millions of dollars. And I sent him money back in 2003 and 4. I was sending him money because I was getting involved with showing this disclosure project talk, and I was taking in money for my expenses and stuff. So I was passing that on to his project because it was his materials, my way of thinking, but what I'm saying is nothing, absolutely zero has come out of Greer in terms of the energy issue.
That's what I was thinking, unfortunately, I think money comes into a lot of this. So I think they start off with good intentions, a lot of these researchers, and I think kind of they see the dollar sign and think, I'm going to make a lot of money out of this. And I think that kind of takes over.
It does, and I think this is particularly true in Greer's case. And I think for certain activities that he's done, I think, for example, when he did that Disclosure Project event, I think it cost something like, it was something like $10,000 just to hire the venue. I remember reading that somewhere, which is fair enough. It was a prestigious venue and he was trying to make it a credible kind of initiative.
That's right. I mean, when I first saw that, I thought, wow, everything's going to break loose now and everyone's going to come out of the woodwork. But it's still bubbling around, isn't it, Disclosure?
It is. There's been many sort of forms since. So I think, I don't want to totally knock him, but I would advise anyone to read his own book, the Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge book that he wrote in 2006. I read that fairly recently, and there's some quite interesting bits and bobs that you'll pick up in there. Yeah,
I agree with you. I think there's certainly an essence of originality and truth in there, definitely.
Yeah. And I mean, again, you can't just say that Greer is his witnesses, so to speak. Some of his witnesses have been around for a long time. Particularly thinking of Graham Bethune, for example, who was the guy who flew from Keflavik, Iceland. I think it was like 1952 or something. I can't remember the exact date. And I think it was him and his co-pilot, and they saw a craft, it had a corona discharge, and it followed them and went from one side of the aircraft to the other. And he'd been telling that story for years. And then, of course, Stephen Greer picked it up for the Disclosure Project conference. And Graham Bethune is one of those guys, if you go and listen to him, you can just, he's telling the truth. He's not he's just a down-to-earth chap telling it how it happened, and he's a good example of I think the best sort of witnesses that Greer assembled for that event.
Sure, yeah. I mean, as well as me. I'm being the frauds. They really turn me off. As soon as I get a hint that someone's a fraud, then that's it for me.
This is it. And absolutely. And I'm pretty much the same. And certainly there are aspects of Greer. I mean, I won't go into now, which I'm deeply unhappy about.
Which is a shame, isn't it? Because it spoils all the good stuff they do.
It does, and you tend to find that any respect that you had for these people pretty much evaporates fairly quickly when you find out certain things, and that's essentially what I found out about Greer. I mean, I don't want to go into that here, but that's what this is something I found out after several years of looking at it. Probably 4 or 5 years. It's not something I found out straight away. And
it starts making you question everything they say, doesn't it? Once you find out there's one lie or misleading statement.
That's right. But I mean, again, some of his witnesses, like Bill Uhouse is another one who's quite interesting. He's got an interesting account about working with an alien on back engineering a craft. And in Bill Uhouse's case, you can, again, the interviews are on YouTube, and you can listen to his testimony if you wish. And he was one I couldn't really make my mind up about. But I think there must be something like what he talked about must have happened based on people I later came into contact with, who weren't in Stephen Greer's Disclosure Project. Maybe I'll mention one of those in a couple of minutes. But going back a little bit to the sort of route to the secret space program, one of the key concepts, as I mentioned earlier, is this idea of anti-gravity. In other words, can you flick a switch and get something to levitate, for example. Is there any technology, that actually could do that? And most people in my peers in the Open University who are doing physics rather than sort of computing as I'm doing, they would say, no, that's not possible. But they haven't seen and spoken to John Hutchison, for example, who was doing just that. I mean, back in the 80s, he was flicking switches and flicking more switches, and he was getting things to levitate and fly up through the ceiling and even disappear. And he was doing this using, for example, microwaves. And as you know, with some of these UFO cases, people reported heating effects and strange sort of energy effects, which appear to be associated with microwaves. So you can get these various clues if you keep looking at the various witness accounts, phenomena, tying it up with people like what John Hutchison has been doing for decades now. And then, for example, you learn about John Hutchison that he was visited for 4 months by somebody from Los Alamos National Laboratories. And that's right in the heart of the black world where the atomic bomb was developed. So you start to, these are the sorts of areas where you start to get into this, the evidence that there is a secret set of development going on, and you can find out certain things about it, like what I just said. Yeah.
It's kind of like the paranormal links into unknown science, isn't it? Really,
Yeah. And there's even some, I know somebody now that's doing some research where they're trying to, and in fact, there was a chap called Albert Budden who wrote a book called, I'm going to get the title right, I think it was The Electric UFO, if I'm not getting it confused with somebody else's book. Albert Budden's Electric UFO book. And he was looking at electrical phenomena and the UFO issue, and he wrote a chapter about John Hutchison's research, and this was back in sort of 1999, and he called that chapter, I think, the poltergeist machine, because he was likening it to the effects seen with a poltergeist. So, again, is there some crossover here where this idea of, the linking of dimensions, and this is something that comes up with the paranormal, isn't it?
Definitely.
And I think that's valid. That's a valid kind of idea to be looking at and thinking about. In other words, it appears that poltergeist phenomena, the famous case being the Enfield poltergeist, I think that's a real case. I think the people that were involved were experiencing real effects. I don't think they were hoaxing anything. And there was some type of energy which was coming into that scenario and doing things, and maybe that comes out of some type of spiritual force, call it a ghost if you want, but maybe it can also be manipulated with technology, but it ends up being a very, very similar or even the same thing. And this is in general a conclusion I've come to, but I think you can follow this thread of looking at things like John Hutchison's research, looking at where that goes. And then, for example, I came into contact with one of the key people in some of this, which is Edgar Fouché. And you might remember I mentioned him in one of the presentations I think you watched. This is when I went back a couple of years, but I came into contact with him partly because of partly kind of tangentially because of the 9/11 research I'd been doing, and he got in touch with me, and I'd watched his, or rather I'd seen his account, which he made way back in 1998, and sadly Edgar Fouché is no longer with us. He passed on a couple of years ago now, and he back in 1998 made I think a very kind of fundamental presentation at the International UFO Congress in Laughlin, I think it was back then, Nevada, that is, in the US. And he came out with this account of this thing he called the TR-3B, which was the triangular craft. And he basically said how it worked. He told you, for example, that it had a mercury-based plasma in a kind of chamber in the center of it, and it was rotated, I think, at 50,000 RPM, this plasma, and it was cooled to, I think, minus 150 Kelvin, and it was pressurized to, I think, I don't know, so many thousand atmospheres. I can't remember the pressure, but some enormous pressure. And then it had this nuclear thermal engines to propel it. And in the skin of the craft there was quasi-crystals. And if you look at this, you think, well, he's just making it up. But actually, when you go and study this and look at the terms that he's coming out with and look at the sort of techniques he's describing, you find that these have been written about in mainstream science. For example, quasi-crystals weren't really a thing anywhere in science in 1998, but a few years after that, they were written about, and I found a paper, I think, dated in 2004 from, I think, Caltech, I think it was, California Institute of Technology, I think they called it. I found that. And then, as Ed himself later pointed out to me, a chap called Daniel Shechtman, he actually won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 2011 for his work on quasi-crystals, And initially, I'd never heard of quasi-crystals, even though I did physics at university for 3 years. And I'd never heard of metamaterials, which is what quasi-crystals are an example of. Now again, you go on from there with what Ed Fouché told me, and told not just me, but many others. He said that the quasi-crystals, they were used as part of something we mentioned earlier, which was the stealth mechanism. He said that the TR3B's, shell, its skin, had various sort of advanced properties where it could be completely invisible to radar, and I think he even implied that it could be optically stealthy as well as, radar stealth. And he said that the quasi-crystals were used in the skin, and you're thinking, you're sort of nodding, really? And then in 2012, I think it was, I've got a link to this in my book and in the PDF, I discovered a lecture by somebody from Imperial College, and I should remember the name of this guy. I'll see if I can get it from the file I've got here. But he basically was doing this lecture. It was a lecture for physicists at Imperial College, and he was talking about, guess what, quasi-crystals. And he showed a little diagram on the screen, and I think I screenshotted this and put it in my book, because he was saying that you could use quasi-crystals to have a substance that had a negative refractive index. And that means that you could actually use this material to project an image out from the surface of a material.
Yeah, kind of like a mirror, I suppose, is it?
Yeah, sort of like a mirror, but it wouldn't work the same way as a mirror. In other words, you could project it in a way which was different to how a mirror works. And he pointed out in this lecture that this was an example of a metamaterial being used for stealth. And again, that was something that Ed Fouché had said 14 years earlier. Because Ed Fouché wasn't a physicist. He was basically a technician and a team builder. He got into sort of more management roles, according to what he told me. And he had 900 documents that he kept to prove, that he really was in the places he said he was. He did the courses that he said he did. And he even had a document which said that, he worked at Nellis Air Force Base in 1979, which was when he said that he was seconded, or rather he was filling in for somebody, working in Area 51. And, basically everything that he told me, and I've got quite a list in my book.
Sorry, it's my phone. Sorry, the wife will get it. It's all right. Okay. I'll put the phone in the other room. Sorry about it, everyone. Carry on.
That's all right. And Ed he's produced all these documents, and he worked in Area 51, so he can prove that he essentially worked in Area 51 in 1979. And it was then, on one of his days there, that he actually said he saw one of these TR3B, the Flying Triangle, landed near on the tarmac near the facility where he was working, and he said that's what he saw. and he said he'd seen these flying triangles, I think, on three occasions back in the 70s. And of course, many other people have seen them as well. I mentioned about that in the book, in the Secret Space Program book. There was a NIDS study of flying triangles, and a friend of mine who's no longer with us, Omar Fowler, he did a study of flying triangles stretching over several years, mainly UK based. So these flying triangles have been seen for probably 2 or 3 decades now. And, yeah, and I'm sure you've had some people telling you.
I've not seen one myself, but I've certainly heard of. Wasn't there the one over Phoenix was a big triangle, wasn't it? I think that was a V shape, wasn't it? One of the big ones. I don't think it's. Oh, that's right. Yeah, you're right. You beg your pardon. Yeah, it was a V shape. Yeah.
Yeah, but there was one sighting which was very prominent, which was over Sheffield in 1997. I mentioned this in the book, and that, got all that information from Max Burns, who investigated that case, and that's a very, very peculiar case, and people can read about that on my website, and Max Burns did a talk on that, I think back in 2011, and he kindly gave me all his files for that. I think I helped him out a little bit with some formatting issues or something, nothing major, but so that investigation was done by Max Burns, and that appears to be quite a solid witness account of this flying triangle. And so going back to the secret space program, one might surmise that based on what Ed Fouché told us, that might be one of the craft that could potentially be used as part of a secret space program.
When you think about it, it was 20 years ago, they even used that technology in the James Bond film, didn't they, in the car, in the invisible car. So when you think about it, it's 20 years ago, I think it's about 20 years ago, they must have been working on that sort of technology, because these things do get out, don't they? They don't
Well, they do. And more recently I was reading this book about the alleged base at Dulce, New Mexico, that everyone talks about, or a lot of people talk about in the UFO field. And it's a very good book, and I urge people to try and download that and read it, because I think it's out of print. You can only get the PDF now, I think. And it's just called Dulce Base, and it's by Greg Valdez. And I've been mentioning this book a lot recently, because I'd heard the Dulce Base story, the Phil Schneider story, and Thomas Costello, I can't remember his exact name.
Costello thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and they claim that they went to this base and there's all these aliens there and stuff.
Yeah.
And
how do you find that feasible? Some of those.
Well, not really, because I was always a bit sceptical of it, because it's just initially seemed too fantastic. And I think when I looked at Phil Snyder's case, there was one lecture in particular that I think it's still online, where he actually opens up and he says he's forgotten his notes and he left them in his car, and he can't give a lecture. He's just literally rambling on for about 45 minutes about American patriotism.
Oh, right.
and yet
it's a bit different, isn't it?
Yeah, it was. But he claims, for example, that he was shot in the chest by an alien, so with a plasma discharge weapon or something. And I'm thinking to myself, and it wasn't just that. There's other things as well with Phil Snyder, but I was thinking, well, if you've been shot by an alien, you don't need to have notes about that, do you, to tell that story?
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I think you'd remember that, wouldn't you?
Exactly, and there were things like that, and so I didn't feel comfortable that he was being totally honest about his story. But if you read the Greg Valdez book, Greg Valdez was the son of this chap called Gabe Valdez, who was actually a police officer in the area, and as a police officer, he was involved with investigating the cattle mutilations which were happening in that vicinity around this Dulce Base. And the Greg Valdez book, Dulce Base, goes into all of that. And Gabe Valdez, he was a very thorough guy. He was a police officer, a police investigator, and he actually did background checks on these people that were coming out with these stories, like Phil Snyder and there was a couple other people that were telling these stories. He didn't really believe their stories. He couldn't find any evidence. But between them, a group of them, they did find evidence that there is a secret base at Dulce, but, you can't say what's in the base. They did find a vent in the mountainside. They found an area where it looked like a plane could fly in secretly. They didn't find the entrance, but they could see where the entrance probably was. They found these towers, which were said to be, I think, fire towers, but when you went up to these towers, or looked at them through binoculars, they were totally different to fire towers, and this whole area of land had been bought off, and they traced who had bought it, and it was all very dodgy, and they think it linked back probably to Los Alamos National Laboratories, because again, Dulce Base is, I think, about 150 miles, or this Dulce area, Dulce Archuleta Mesa as it's called, in Archuleta Mountain, it's about 150 miles from Los Alamos, and they came to the conclusion that this base was there, and it was almost certainly an off-site laboratory for Los Alamos, and they were doing stuff in the field, and he goes into that in the book.
So really, all the stuff that from Area 51, all these people that want to storm it, they probably moved it all anyway.
Quite possibly, and there's talk of other bases, aren't there? Like, beneath Denver Airport, there's meant to be a big complex, isn't there? And there's also another one at Dugway Proving Grounds.
Cheyenne Mountain as well is the...
Cheyenne Mountain, that's another one. And I mean, Ed Fouché told me that he actually went into Edwards Air Force Base as part of his... regular work, 'cause he was a cryptographics technician, and he said there were a lot of underground tunnels there, a couple of which he went into, and he could see that there were these big doors, going off into other tunnels, but he wasn't cleared to go into those areas, so he didn't. But he said that he was in there, and they have this facility called DARK as well, which was the Defense and Advanced Research. I can't remember what the C stood for. But some of that's in the book. So I think Ed Fouché, he basically, in himself and talking to some friends, he became fairly convinced that there was some type of secret space program. He encountered some equipment which was in Area 51 that was beaming voice signals into space, or there was a board that he was looking at that he called it the DOSL module, Direct Orbital Code Link, I think it was called, and he was able to do some tests on this to try and fix it, and he realised that they were sending voice signals into space, and this was in 1979, and this was from Area 51, so there was no shuttle then, it was after Skylab, so he wondered what they were actually sending up there, again, doesn't prove that a secret space program exists, and the existence of these flying triangles doesn't prove that a secret space program exists. But if you look, for example, I mean, the other thing which I like to mention, just to try and make people think a little bit about the idea is, if you read Nick Cook's book, he talks about, and Paul Laviolette talks about this as well in his Secrets, Dr. Paul Laviolette, he talks about this in Secrets of Antigravity Research. They both talk about, in the 1950s up to the mid-50s, most of the big aerospace companies were talking about there being some type of anti-gravity technique or technology that they were working on, and they were going to be able to exploit this to develop some new, novel, advanced forms of propulsion. And most of the aerospace companies were saying similar things. And then, in 1956, if you look at the timescale, all of that talk seemed to pretty much stop within about a year, 2 years maybe, something like that. And it was then really the only time you'd see anti-gravity mentioned was in a science fiction book, or a film or something, and it was never really mentioned in the mainstream at all. And what happened the next year, 1957, it was Sputnik, and since then, since Sputnik, we've just had chemical rockets as being space propulsion, and that's it. Okay, we've had ion drive, I suppose, and this Deep Space One probe that went up about, 20 odd years ago now, probably. But there's been no talk of exotic propulsion in the mainstream, or, well, I'll say no, virtually none is perhaps what I should say. And so, Nick Cook points out, as others do, that in the mid-50s, Thomas Townsend Brown, who had been working on the gravitator disk technology since the 1920s, he had put together this Project Winterhaven proposal where he was going to work with a group of scientists and the Department of Defense to develop various technologies, one of which I think was magnetohydrodynamics, which some think might be a method of anti-gravity propulsion. And you can read that Project Winterhaven document. It's online. You can go and read it. It's quite an interesting document. Again, it doesn't say anywhere in it, oh yes, we're going to work on a secret space program or anything like that. But, if you look at the time scales, is it just a coincidence that all this talk of anti-gravity technology stopped in 1956 from all the companies, and then the rocket technology became to the fore in 57. And I don't think it is a coincidence. I think there were underground projects that were done. I think they did either get some technology from Roswell or other crashes.
I was going to mention that. Do you think they were working on reverse engineering of some sort?
I think they were trying it. I think they've been trying that for a number of years. I don't know if they were genuinely successful. I think what to me might be a little bit more likely is that they weren't able to sort of necessarily reverse engineer the technology directly, but they may have been able to sort of look a little bit at some of the materials and try to make similar materials themselves, or look at some of the properties and try and mimic those properties as best they could with the technology they had. So they might, for example, have switched on, had a craft, switched it on and detected some type of microwaves coming out of it, just as an example. And then they might have thought, well, we need to develop some technology which will generate these types of microwaves or something like that. But I don't necessarily think they were able to directly take a craft and just reverse engineer it openly and get it to work 100%.
No. But I think you've answered I was going to ask you the question: do you believe there was a Roswell crash that they reverse engineered? And you've really answered that by saying that you do really anyway. So,
yeah, I mean, I don't know whether they reverse engineered it. And I know obviously most of us have probably read the Colonel Corso book, The Day After Roswell, and that's a very worthwhile book to read.
Yeah, very interesting. But some people say that a lot of that was he was misled himself on a lot of that. But I don't know. He had a very major job in the Pentagon anyway, didn't he?
He did, and I'll tell you what I came to the conclusion of that, and the reason why, because I put that in the Secret Space Program book. Because I think Corso, he did know that there was stuff going on, but I think he was, I don't mean to be sort of denigrate him, I think he was kind of like a gopher, and I think he was involved in some type of he was going between groups and offices, and maybe there was some general, like I think General Trudeau was his senior, and I think he probably was acting as a go-between between Trudeau and some of these black programs, but he didn't really fully grasp what was going on.
No.
You know what I mean?
Probably a lot of it was hidden from him anyway,
Yeah, that's right. I think a lot of it would have been hidden, so he got wind that there was stuff going on. And I think why I say this is what you can do is, it's as you more or less said that he was, I think in what you said about his book, if you read his book, then of course we know it was co-written by Bill Burns, and some people have pointed out that he embellished a lot of the stuff, and he added bits or he changed bits slightly, and there is actually a statement by Philip Corso Jr. on one of the websites, I think it's the Open Minds website, where when Corso saw the book, when it had been published, he opened it, and he was flicking through the pages, and Philip Corso Jr. was saying, he was shaking his head, because he changed it all.
Yeah.
And so what Corso did was he got his notes out and he typed all his notes up himself, and that file of notes is available for a free download. I think it's about 170 pages long, and I've read it, and it's on the Open Minds website. Or
Hello, I think we've lost Andrew.
Okay.
Hello, Andrew. Right.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, a little bit of a technical difficulty there, but Andrew had a power cut, so I'll cut a little bit.
Yeah, power went out because it went out earlier today as well. So
right.
Sort of half
yeah, we've had some awful weather, haven't we? Always storms and God knows what else. But anyway, you were saying.
Yeah, so going back, we're in the middle of the Corso thing, and as I say, you can download Corso's notes as a PDF file. From I think it's on the Internet Archive, but I think this file was originally posted by Open Minds.
I should definitely download that, because that was a fascinating book, and I'd like to see what differences were.
And I think basically when you read that set of notes, it's interesting, and there are a few things in there which are not in the book, one of which I'll mention in a couple of minutes, which particularly caught my interest. But you know, when you read it, you can see that Corso needed a co-author, because there are places where he repeats things and it's not very well organised, you know, and things sort of backwards and forwards, and there's parts where you're not really sure exactly what he's describing and things like that. And so Bill Burns, I think, did help to clarify some of those things, but perhaps he did either intentionally or unintentionally, you know, add or take away certain things. So maybe
a bit of show business popped in.
A little bit. But possibly that's what happened. But you know, I basically got the impression that Corso was an honest guy. I don't think he was trying to, you know, he wasn't trying to make stuff up to you know, make money. But I think he probably embellished some things a little bit. That's kind of the impression that I got from him. But in particular, one thing that really intrigued me when I read that, and I mentioned this in my Finding the Secret Space Program book, was that he talked about having this war with the aliens. And, you know, this isn't new either. I mean, and I think he mentioned that in the Roswell book. But what he said in one particular bit was he said that, the aliens had, you know, impinged on our airspace and our domain and stuff. And so we, you know, they'd attack the aliens. That's what he was saying. And he said that what they should do is they should go and bomb Phobos. And of course, Phobos is one of the moons of Mars. And that really, to me, was just like plonked in the middle of the book, these notes or book or whatever you want to call it, with not really much of a build-up. And why that particularly caught my interest was because I'd written about Phobos in my other book, which is called Secrets in the Solar System, Gatekeepers on Earth, also free PDF download. And there's quite a bit of information about Phobos, which has been more recently studied, like in the last 15 years, by the Mars Express probe and one or two other probes that have been there. And Phobos is very unusual. It's actually, even a scientific paper has been published that says that it's hollow, essentially. And that was suspected by a Russian scientist called Slotsky, I forget how to pronounce his name, way back in the 1960s. And the very, very unusual thing is that Phobos was only discovered in the 1800s, I think something like 1837 or sometime around then. Relatively recent discovery, because it's very, very close to the surface of Mars in relative terms. It's only about, I think, 5,000 miles above the surface of Mars, whereas our moon is 283,000 miles. And it's also got a very, almost perfectly circular orbit around Mars.
I think it's smaller than our moon as well, isn't it?
Yes, it's a lot smaller. It's only about 15 kilometres at its widest, I think, and 26 along the way. And the very strange thing most people don't know about Phobos, and I didn't know about Phobos, is that if you read the Gulliver's Travels story, which was written in 1756 or something, or it was very early, much earlier than I thought. The Lilliputians, who are the little people that attend to Gulliver, they have these astronomers in the story, and the astronomers describe the two moons of Mars, and they describe that they have a 20-hour orbit, which is actually very close to what the real situation is, even though they weren't discovered by astronomers until 150 years after this story was written.
That is really strange, isn't it?
It is. So, in other words, and then when I saw this reference in Corso's
notes... It's almost like secret knowledge, isn't it? Because sort of...
It is. I think it is.
But things sort of like slip out occasionally.
Yeah, but that's not in the Day After Roswell book. I checked because I got a PDF of that and did a search for Phobos, and I certainly didn't remember reading it. People are free to correct me on any of this if they find that I'm mistaken, but... So it was interesting. So in other words, that makes me think that Corso did know stuff. Somebody had told him, or he found something relating to Phobos, which, I mean, most people have never heard of Phobos. You know, I knew about Phobos because I've been interested in astronomy since I was like...
Yeah, Phobos and Deimos, isn't it? Is the two
that's correct. And, you know, yeah, some people have heard about them, but it's not the first sort of thing that comes to people's minds as being potentially connected to this sort of UFO alien type question. And of course, then we get into the whole thing with Mars, you know, and even Major Kehoe, he said way back in the 1950s that he'd noticed that there seemed to be a correlation with an increase in the UFO sightings and reports when Mars was getting closer to us. So I think he had said in one or more interviews, and maybe in his book, that he felt that some of the ETs could come from Mars. You know, and whole films have been made about that idea and science fiction stories.
War of the Worlds was the main one, wasn't it?
War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells,
the Martians,
yeah, that's right. You know, and some of that I go into in the Secrets in the Solar System book. So I think, you know, that's going back to the secret space program. There was another very interesting clip that somebody sent me a good few years ago, over 10 years ago, by a chap called William Hamilton. And this is a clip that I reference over and over again because it's so interesting. And he said he met with this colonel, I think he was in the Air Force, and this was, I think, probably back in the sort of 80s. And he said that he'd been on a ship that could go 0.8 C, which is 8/10 the speed of light. And he said, William Hamilton asked this guy, he said, so how, you know, he says you can get to Mars in like, I don't know, whatever it is, 20 minutes or something. And he says, how do you know that? And he said, I've been there. This colonel said that he'd been to Mars, and he said that they landed underground in this base, and William Hamilton says, you know, the colonel wouldn't tell him who built this base, you know, or anything about the base. He said that he wouldn't tell him about that, but he did say that he'd been to Mars on this craft that could travel at 8/10 speed of light. And to me that sounded fantastic in one sense, but the way that Hamilton described that story and how he met this colonel and the sort of other things he was saying, it somehow did seem credible to me, you know, that this is indeed what's been happening.
Unfortunately, we do know that there are some very convincing liars, though, Andrew, don't we?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, I mean, that always fascinates me. That, I mean, it's like the George Adamski stories, isn't it?
Yeah.
But going to Venus and everything.
Yeah.
I kind of believed them, but then you think, well, it just doesn't, you know, it's just hard to believe, you know. But the thing is, he's so descriptive about what he could see from the ship, you know. And when we see spacecraft, you know, in space now, it's very similar to what he described, you know. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if you can put that in the same category as the secret space program, but.
No, well, I think, you know, I mean, again, going back to the 50s and the Adamski accounts, I think that he did have some experiences, and I think some of them were legitimate, but I think he maybe embellished some of them, and again... Yeah,
it could be that. He might have thought, I can make some more money out of this. Yeah. It could well be that, yeah.
You know, and if you listen to Desmond Leslie, who was his co-author, there's some interviews on YouTube with Desmond Leslie, and there's some writings of Desmond Leslie, and it makes you wonder. He more or less said a similar thing, you know, and he couldn't make his mind up about whether Adamski was telling the whole truth. And I do mention that in my acknowledged book. I mentioned a little bit about Desmond Leslie's assessment and so forth.
Sorry to interrupt you. You know what I think sometimes? I think if someone's telling the truth like that, you might get some sort of an influence that might want to make his story sound so ridiculous, so he gets encouraged to tell more and embellish it. so that it does sound ridiculous and then not acceptable by the acceptable by the readers or the general public.
I agree. Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's
yeah.
kind of to make it sound so ridiculous that it's not happening. Yeah, that's kind of just my idea. But I think it's a possibility. I think the same sort of thing with Stephen Greer. Like, he started out, with all good intentions, but someone else influences him to think, you can make a lot of money, and you start going off on a different tangent.
Oh yeah, and I think there's various ways that this happens. I think some people it goes to their head, so to speak, in one way or another. But I think certain people are working for the agencies. I mean, Stephen Greer himself, just going back to him for a minute, he actually said in an interview, and I've got the recording, that he essentially admitted that he works for the CIA. He said he was offered protection by them, and he agreed to have protection from them. And that was in a fairly recent interview from about 3 years ago, which subsequently got taken down, but not before I'd saved the recording of it. So, I think that brings us on to how the cover-up is maintained. And people are manipulated. Disinformation is deliberately put out there, and people are co-opted into these various, things like the TTSA thing and whatnot. And in other words, the TTSA are claiming that they're the sorts of language that they're using implies that they're trying to develop not a secret space program, but a new public space program. But it's all just hot air when you start to pull it apart, and they're not actually admitting to what has already been developed, stuff like Ed Fouché was telling us about, 20 years ago. So, that's my impression of that, there are other areas that you can look at to indicate that other things appear to have been done. For example, there was experiments done by Eric Laithwaite and Bruce De Palma with gyroscopes, and it appears that they appear to show a type of weight loss, and so that appears to be another way of exploiting or potentially changing the gravity field, is with using devices that are spinning at very high speeds, and some of these have been demonstrated repeatedly, but are alleged to have no practical value, So I've got quite a few examples like that in the Finding the Secret Space Program book. The other one I mentioned briefly a few minutes ago is Thomas Townsend Brown, and he was working on electrogravitics starting in the 1920s. That has quite a lot of documentation associated with it, along with the fact that letters on his website in his archive suggest that he was sworn to secrecy on some of this work and couldn't tell people what he was doing. If you can't tell people what he's doing, then who's in control of that? And it's
something's going on, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not the universities, is it? So who will it be? Well, it's going to be the military.
Yeah.
Well,
a big telling thing to me is all these trillions of dollars that go missing every year from the Pentagon, and nobody seems to know where it's gone. So
that's right. I agree with you. And there's a number of other projects, even some of the NASA Apollo programs. I think some of that money must have been siphoned off into black programs somehow. I can't prove that, but that's what I suspect has been happening.
I mean, it's not really part of the secret space program, or is it? But you don't really believe that they went to the moon, do you? I know it's...
No, I mean, I think it's connected, you see, because if we take the view that they did start to work on anti-gravity technology and had made some type of breakthrough, because they'd had the Roswell craft for nearly 10 years. So let's just imagine that they'd started to make some type of breakthrough in material science in the mid-50s or late 50s, then they wanted to keep all the good minds focused on something. So that's when the chemical rockets program got going. And the follow-on to that, of course, or the later parts of that, were the Apollo program. And again, if you look at the evidence for what actually happened, there's some very peculiar things that you begin to find out, again, which appear to be related to some type of secrecy. And an early critic of the state of the Apollo program was Gus Grissom, Virgil Grissom.
Yeah, and he died, didn't he?
he died with Ed Chafee and Ed Wise, and I can't remember Chafee's first name, maybe Robert, and they died in the Apollo 1 fire. And it was very soon after they started to, in fact, Grissom held a press conference because he was so concerned that there weren't, enough progress on Apollo. And then there was another guy called, I think, Thomas Ronald Barron. He was also, he was a quality control guy, and he was cataloguing all these kind of breaches of the procedures. And he then came to the conclusion that they were never going to, meet the targets because the quality control wasn't good enough for stuff to work well enough, when they actually wanted to use it. And he wrote a 500-page report, and there was a congressional hearing of some kind, and you can find the details of this. Some of it's on the Clavius website, actually. And he publishes this report, Thomas Ronald Barron, and then 3 weeks later, and not long after Grissom, he was dead, and his family were dead as well. They were killed in a car crash on a level crossing. So, is this just a coincidence? Were they keeping secrets within Apollo? And I'd say absolutely yes.
I'm absolutely sure they were covering stuff up. Yeah. But I still can't get my head round that they didn't go to the moon, but because I sort of lived through that period and sort of seeing them,
of course,
or thinking I saw them go to the moon. And,
well, this is it. And I think, but when it took me, going back to my own personal experience, finding out about that, I watched Apollo, when I was 4 years old, when they watched the landing and some of the missions. And I had in fact, my brother had an Airfix model of the Saturn V, about 2 meters, I think about a meter high. I was really jealous, And I had the books and we had some of those coins that came out, I think they gave me away.
I used to follow the space program sort of religiously back then when I was sort of an older teenager. But to actually think that they've faked it, I still can't get my head around it. Excuse me for saying that, but
no, I think it takes a while, and I think you've got to really get into it to convince yourself. It's not. I don't think it's something that not everyone can just kind of see it straight off. Some people have said they knew it was fake from the get-go. You've probably spoken to some people, and so have I. Yeah. But for me, it wasn't like that. And it wasn't until about a couple of years I was looking at it. And I think it was Bart Sabrell's documentaries that really sort of tipped me over the edge. And
so I don't know if you saw it. A few weeks back, there was a program on, was it a Discovery or the History Channel, about the moon landings or actually sort of debunking the debunkers, if you like. And it was to say about the things like the Van Allen belt and everything. They couldn't go through it, and it wasn't actually what they were saying. It wasn't actually the Van Allen belt that was. It's dangerous, but it's the time spent in it.
I've heard these arguments as well, and that's a contentious area. And indeed, people will quote Van Allen himself because, he was the guy that had put this Geiger counter in, I think it was the Explorer 2 probe, and discovered that it went off the scale, massively, at this point, and that's how they were discovered. And but then he described it when in that whatever scientific paper he wrote in the late 50s that it was lethal radiation, and then he was asked this question by somebody at some point, probably in the 80s or 90s, and or whenever it was, and he said, "Oh well, actually the belts mustn't have been as dangerous as I thought because the Apollo astronauts landed on the moon." So it becomes a circular argument. But one of the key pieces of evidence that I quote, for example, which you can't really, in my way of understanding things, get around, is this Charlie Juke photograph, where he took this ordinary photograph of his family, and for some odd reason, it seems pretty odd, but they did it, it's in the Apollo record, it's on NASA's website, they put this photograph in a plastic bag and laid it on the moon's surface, according to the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal and the pictures that are there. The problem is that when you see this picture, it's just sitting there. But the average surface temperature of the moon, this is the average, is 100 degrees centigrade. That's the boiling point of water. And the hottest temperature, I think, is about 140. And if you put a piece of, an ordinary photograph, certainly in paper that was in use in the 1970s, it curls up, it convolves, it's called convolution, because of the different sort of fibres in the paper and stuff, stretching or contracting different amount.
Fahrenheit 451? Was that the burning?
That's the burning point of paper. Obviously, it's not that high, but yeah, I mean, if you look at this picture, there is no way that has to be shot in a studio. And there's another very interesting sequence which is kind of similar, which is illustrated in Jet Windsor's film, which is called Moon Hoax Now, and this was something I only became aware of 2 or 3 years ago, in that there is a sequence, I think, in Apollo 17, where if you go through the images from the Apollo 17 mission, you will find a number of them have this weird smearing on them. And it's like something has been spilled onto the camera. And again, if you read the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal, that's exactly what happened. They actually spilt a bit of fluid from their helmets onto the camera. And according to the Lunar Surface Journal, what happened was they took this camera inside the lunar module, they changed the film, and while they were doing this, some orange juice came out, and then, it got onto the plate, or got onto the lens or something, and that's what caused these splodges on these pictures. But Jet Windsor actually examines this in very close detail, and what you find is that the timing of the photographs, and there is some video that's associated with this event as well, the spilling event, and what's in the Lunar Surface Journal, they don't match up properly. There's a bit of disparity between the sequence of events. And he comes to the conclusion from studying this that what happened was that the splodges were when orange juice leaked out of the helmet and onto the camera while they were on the studio set. And if orange juice leaked out of the helmet, join, then the suits weren't airtight. So if they weren't airtight, they weren't on the moon, because if they weren't airtight, they would have been dead. And if you watch that sequence, it's pretty hard to argue with that, the way you sort of examine that. And there are several issues like that as well, which I've come across. And anybody that's interested, I urge them to kind of study that in more detail.
Yeah, I think this show you've left us with more questions than you have answers, Andrew.
That's often the way, unfortunately.
But, well, I don't know what else I think we're sort of running on I'll probably could be running the next program in a minute, but luckily, because we do a podcast now, it doesn't matter so much. But is there much? I mean, I don't really know what else to ask you, to be honest. I mean, what's your feelings on time travel? Do you think they may have done anything in that direction?
It's not something I've looked into greatly. Again, you hear lots of stories, but the other thing that comes up with the technology when you start looking at it, and this is something that John Hutchison has mentioned, is that when you get into this anti-gravity area, it appears that the temporal effects are also involved. Not necessarily this idea where you can go inside a box and then close it, press a button, and then materialise in the 13th century or the 26th century, anything like that. I've never really come across anything like that. But John Hutchison has talked about temporal effects. For example, one that's measurable is the microwave background, radiation background count, whereby, if you will have heard of this before, where you get a Geiger counter, just have it in your house or something, and it will always click off. I think it's something like 4 or 5 counts a minute or something, and it's a fairly consistent rate if you don't have any radioactive sources nearby. It's like 5 or whatever counts a minute. But what John Hutchison noticed is when he was doing his levitation experiments, he at one point decided to put a Geiger counter into the mix of things, and he noticed that the background count had dropped. So that he attributes that, I think, and effects in some of the metal samples that he saw to effects on the time field of some kind. And again, if people read Wilbert Smith's writings, Wilbert Smith was a Canadian radio engineer who came into contact with what he called the boys' topside, in other words, ETs, and they talked about how they would extract energy from the tempic field, as they called it, the time field. So again, that he implies that they were manipulating the field of time to extract energy. So there is some relationship to time and how time works, but as regards, going backwards and forwards between different dates, like a TARDIS or whatever, I've not really come across that.
But yeah, that's why I mentioned the time travel thing, because I think when you start talking about what you were talking about with the space travel and everything, I think time's got to come into it, time travel of some sort.
Yeah. I think it's definitely the case.
As deep as it is, because I mean, as I say, I think you've raised more questions than answers here today. And
I mean, again, I encourage people to read the books.
Oh yeah. I'll definitely put all the links on my page and everything, and obviously you might, and if anyone wants to get in touch with you, you can get through to Andrew on that page as well, can't you? Check it.
Yeah, I mean that's right.
Check the evidence page.
Check the evidence. Yeah, you click on the contact button and fill that in, and you may have a trouble sending a message. Some people report trouble with that form, but it's got a spam blocker on it, and maybe it's a bit overzealous at times. But my email address is on the site in the top left, so you can always use that if the contact form doesn't work.
That's right. Or you can always get in touch with me if you're having trouble getting in touch with Andrew, and I can link you up.
Yeah, and I'm on Facebook as well, so people can find me on there.
Yeah, I'll put a link to your Facebook page as well. Well, Andrew, that's been absolutely fascinating talk, and I hope one day you'll come back again, because we've got other subjects we could cover as well.
Absolutely, David. Anytime, just send me a message and we can arrange it.
It's been a great pleasure talking to you again, Andrew. So, and what you got planned in the future? Anything coming up?
Well, I've got a couple of small talks coming up, which will be one's going to be at the Newmarket venue for the East Anglia UFO group again. And that's on, I think, crikey, I should go and look on my website. It's in September, basically, and I think it's the 16th. So I'll just have a double check.
Later in September, is it? Yeah.
Yeah,
I've got the Colonel Holt conference in early September.
Oh, have you?
So
yes.
if you're in the area.
Yeah, maybe if I'm in there, I might try and make it over for that. So yeah, it's the 23rd of September, 23rd. For the East Anglia UFO group. I've got the, Truth Seekers Northeast on the 7th, and,
that's another very good group actually, isn't it?
Yeah, they're really good. Maureen's done a really good job with that group. She does it really well. And then I'm going to be in Shepley at the Holistic Wellbeing, which is quite near Holmfirth for those that have been to Gary Heseltine's conferences. Not that we want to I shouldn't bring that name up, should I?
No, not really.
But, this isn't, Gary Heseltine's conference, it's another chap,
I'll cut that out later.
Okay. Holistic Wellbeing, but if you want to, that's fine. Holistic Wellbeing in Shepley.
No, I was only joking, I won't really.
Yeah, that's right. That's on the 13th of October. And the last two talks that I just mentioned, the September and the October ones, are the acknowledged book about the UFO stuff, and the Newcastle one is going to be about the Madeleine McCann stuff.
Right, yeah. There's some new developments in there, aren't there? But,
a little bit, yeah. So,
that goes outside the realms of the paranormal, but, it's still a fascinating case, but then again, I'm going to finish it off there, because Madeleine McCann is only one of millions of children that go missing.
Yes.
All over the world, and it's kind of, it amazes me how so much focus of attention has been on one child when so many do go missing. You know, But, as I say, that's a whole different issue. But, okay, well, I'll have to leave it there, Andrew, I think, and thank you very much for joining me on this show today, and, hope you have a good evening, and I'll have to leave it there, and thank everybody for listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network and Paranormal Dimensions with David Young and Andrew Johnson, who will say goodbye to now, and thank you for coming, Andrew.
Thank you very much for having me, David. I appreciate it.
I hope you'll come back again, and it's been a fascinating show. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
For me, this is the kind of show that I like doing most, where you basically just have a freewheeling discussion, have a chance to go off on topics. That's what's going to make you an outstanding player in the field. Just keep doing it.
Paranormal Dimensions is a regular feature on Mondays on the Paranormal UK radio network.